There's a body of water in the Scottish Highlands that holds more mystery than its size alone would suggest. From the air, on a clear summer morning, Loch Ness looks almost gentle, a long silver ribbon laid into a valley, mirroring the clouds, fringed by green hills and the ruins of Urquhart Castle. Tourists photograph it from the roadside and call it beautiful, and it is. But people who've lived along its shoreline for generations will tell you something the postcards don't mention. They'll tell you the water is cold, dark, and stubborn, that fishermen and boat captains have spent decades reporting things on its surface that don't have easy explanations, and that after 91 years and thousands of individual sightings, the debate over what, if anything, lives in that lake still hasn't fully closed. The honest answer to what's actually down there isn't a confirmed monster, and it isn't nothing either. It's something genuinely stranger, a lake so difficult to study that real scientific instruments have recorded real, unexplained readings for decades, right alongside a mountain of hoaxes, misidentifications, and wishful thinking that makes sorting fact from fiction a real challenge even for serious researchers. Start with why Loch Ness is such a difficult place to investigate in the first place, because the lake's physical properties are central to why this mystery has survived so long. It's not an ordinary lake. It's a flooded fault line carved by glaciers, running about 23 miles through the Great Glen and reaching depths of over 750 feet in places, deeper than most of the North Sea. It holds more fresh water than all the lakes of England and Wales combined. The water itself resists observation. It's stained nearly black by peat washing down from the surrounding hills, and visibility can collapse to just a few feet below the surface. A diver descending into Loch Ness doesn't drift gradually from daylight into darkness the way divers do in clearer water. They hit something closer to a wall of blackness fairly abruptly. The deep water also holds at a nearly constant 5 to 6 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to sap strength from a diver's limbs quickly and cold enough, by extension, to slow the metabolism of anything large living in those depths, meaning any animal down there could plausibly survive on relatively little food and surface only rarely. Loch Ness also isn't a sealed system. The River Ness connects it to the sea at its northern end, and since 1822 the Caledonian Canal has linked it directly to the North Sea through a working chain of lochs. Seals have, in fact, been documented well up into the loch on more than one occasion, and Atlantic salmon regularly pass through it on their way to and from the ocean, proof that whatever lives in that lake isn't necessarily trapped there permanently. The modern legend really begins on May 2, 1933, when John and Aldi Mackay, who ran a hotel on the loch's shore, reported watching something large disturb the water's surface a few hundred feet out from where they'd stopped their car. A local correspondent for the Inverness Courier wrote up their account, and an editor reached for the word monster to describe it, the first time the phrase Loch Ness Monster appeared in print. Reports multiplied through the rest of 1933 and into 1934, drawing international press attention, expeditions, and big game hunters to the area. Many of the sighting descriptions shared recurring features, a long neck or humps breaking the surface, though descriptions across witnesses varied considerably in other details as well, which skeptics have long pointed to as evidence consistent with a range of ordinary phenomena, including floating logs, otters, deer swimming across the loch, boat wakes, and wind-driven wave patterns, being mistaken for something more dramatic under emotionally charged, low-visibility conditions. Then, in April 1934, the surgeon's photograph appeared, showing what looked like a long neck and small head rising from the water, attributed to a respected London physician who claimed to have captured it by accident. For 60 years it became the single most famous image associated with the legend, appearing on postcards, mugs, and in nearly every retelling of the story. In 1994, one of the men involved in staging it, Christian Sperling, confessed shortly before his death that the photograph was a hoax. A toy submarine roughly a foot long, fitted with a sculpted head and neck, built and floated on the loch as a deliberate prank connected to an earlier grudge against a newspaper. The confession, corroborated by family members and consistent with earlier technical doubts researchers had raised about the image's scale and proportions, effectively ended the photograph's credibility, and much of the general public treated its exposure as evidence that the entire legend had been debunked in one stroke. That's really the point where the honest version of this story gets more complicated than either extreme, pure hoax or confirmed monster allows for. It's true that the most famous single piece of visual evidence turned out to be fake, and it's also true that serious researchers who'd studied the loch for years had already privately doubted that photograph's authenticity well before the 1994 confession, based on inconsistencies in scale and ripple pattern. But dismissing the photograph doesn't automatically resolve every subsequent piece of instrument data gathered independently over the following decades, and it's worth walking through that data honestly, including the genuine uncertainty and the mundane explanations that responsible researchers have consistently offered alongside it. In December 1954, a fishing boat working the loch with an echo sounder recorded an unusually solid contact at a depth of around 480 feet, a return distinct from the typical scattered signature fish produce, tracking along beneath the boat for a stretch before fading. It's a genuinely documented, independently sourced anomaly, recorded well before the surgeon's photograph scandal and unrelated to it. Nobody has offered a fully confirmed explanation for that particular 1954 reading, though possibilities including large fish, a school behaving in an atypical pattern, or equipment artifacts have all been proposed over the years without full resolution either way. In 1968, a research team from the University of Birmingham led by Professor D. Gordon Tucker brought experimental sonar equipment to the loch, chosen mainly because its depth and enclosed shape made it a convenient natural testing ground rather than because the team had any particular interest in the legend. Their equipment recorded moving underwater targets that Tucker's team found difficult to attribute confidently to fish, and Tucker himself, by most accounts a cautious, technically minded researcher without a personal stake in the Nessie legend, described the results as intriguing enough to warrant further investigation rather than something he could dismiss outright. It's worth being precise about what that actually establishes. An early sonar experiment recorded genuinely puzzling signals under limited technology and analysis methods available at the time, which several researchers since have suggested may be explainable by fish shoals, seals, or the loch's unusual thermal layering effects on acoustic signals, effects that were considerably less well understood by researchers in 1968 than they are today. The following decade brought one of the more famous and more contested pieces of photographic evidence. In 1972 and again in 1975, a team associated with the Academy of Applied Science, led by patent attorney Robert Rines, combined sonar with an underwater camera rigged to fire automatically. Some of the resulting images, after enhancement, appeared to show shapes some interpreted as a flipper or a larger body, and a version of this material was published and discussed in the journal Nature, generating real scientific debate. That debate has never fully resolved in favor of the monster interpretation. Subsequent analysis by other researchers raised serious questions about the enhancement process used on the images, and many experts in image analysis have concluded that flipper photographs likely show floating debris or sediment disturbed near the camera rather than an animal, though the images remain genuinely disputed rather than universally debunked to everyone's satisfaction. The largest coordinated search effort came in October 1987, when researcher Adrian Shine organized Operation Deep Scan, deploying roughly 20 to 25 boats equipped with echo-sounding sonar in a coordinated sweep across the loch. The operation recorded 3 distinct unexplained contacts in deep water, stronger than typical fish echoes and located well below where fish would normally be found, that could not be relocated on follow-up passes. Darrell Lawrence, whose company supplied much of the sonar equipment used, said publicly at the time that he believed there was definitely something down there bigger than a fish, while speculating it was most likely a seal. Shine himself, leading the operation, was notably measured in his own public assessment, stating clearly that while there were strong sonar contacts in the loch, he didn't believe they added up to the classic dinosaur-like monster of popular imagination. Later reviews of Operation Deep Scan by outlets including BBC Science Focus have generally concluded the 3 contacts were most likely debris, thermal layering artifacts, or a seal, while acknowledging that no fully certain identification was ever established for any of the 3. More recent searches have continued producing similarly ambiguous results. A 2023 large-scale volunteer surface search, organized jointly by the Loch Ness Center and the volunteer group Loch Ness Exploration, logged several unexplained sounds and sonar readings, none of which were confirmed as anything beyond ordinary lake activity upon later review, though they generated substantial media attention at the time. Adrian Shine's Loch Ness project has continued monitoring the loch with various instruments over subsequent decades, periodically noting individual sonar traces of interest without ever producing a result the broader scientific community has treated as conclusive. The most scientifically rigorous recent investigation came in 2019, when a team led by geneticist Neil Gemmell of the University of Otago conducted an environmental DNA survey of the loch, collecting 250 water samples from various depths and locations and sequencing roughly 500 million DNA fragments to catalog every species with genetic material present in the water. The results were genuinely clarifying on several fronts. The survey found no DNA evidence of any large reptile, no plesiosaur or anything resembling one, and specifically ruled out shark, catfish, and sturgeon DNA as sources for sightings, addressing several long-standing alternative theories directly. What the survey did find was an unusually large quantity of European eel DNA throughout the loch. Gemmell was careful and precise in how he described the implications of that finding, noting that EDNA data reveals presence and relative abundance but cannot determine the physical size of individual animals contributing that DNA, meaning the survey could confirm eels are extremely plentiful in the loch without being able to confirm or rule out whether any individual eels have grown to unusually large sizes. He described the giant eel theory as a genuinely plausible, if unconfirmed, explanation worth further investigation, while being equally clear that the survey's data alone couldn't settle the question definitively either way. Laid out honestly, here's what the actual evidentiary record supports and doesn't support. It supports that Loch Ness is a genuinely difficult environment to study, with real physical properties, depth, darkness, cold, connection to the sea, that make definitive investigation harder than for most lakes. It supports that a number of independently gathered sonar readings across multiple decades and multiple research teams have recorded contacts that operators at the time found difficult to immediately explain, though it's important to note that difficult to immediately explain with the equipment and knowledge available at the time is a considerably weaker claim than confirmed to be an unknown animal. And later analysis has offered mundane, plausible explanations: seals, debris, thermal layers, misidentified fish, for most of these contacts, even where full certainty was never achieved. It supports that the most famous single piece of visual evidence, the surgeon's photograph, was a confirmed and fully admitted hoax. And it supports that the best available modern genetic survey found no evidence whatsoever for a large unknown reptile or any of the other frequently proposed exotic species, while leaving open, in a narrow and carefully qualified way, the possibility that unusually large eels might explain at least some sightings, a theory its own lead researcher described as plausible but unproven. What it doesn't support, based on the actual documented record rather than the more dramatic framing that tends to circulate in retellings of this story, is a confident conclusion that a specific, identifiable large, unknown animal definitely lives in Loch Ness. The scientists and researchers who've spent the most time and rigor on this question, Gemmell, Shine, and the various sonar teams across the decades, have consistently stopped short of that conclusion themselves, even when their own data produced genuinely puzzling readings. That's worth sitting with, because it's a more interesting and more honest place to land than either extreme. Loch Ness isn't a solved mystery with a confirmed monster living in its depths, and it also isn't a simple hoax that collapsed entirely the moment one famous photograph turned out to be fake. It's a genuinely difficult body of water to fully study, populated by real, if still incompletely understood, aquatic life, including apparently a lot of eels, sitting underneath 91 years of sightings, sonar contacts, and unresolved technical puzzles that no single study, however well designed, has yet managed to fully close the book on. It's worth going back even further than 1933, because the legend's roots are often presented as starting cleanly with the Mackay sighting, when in fact there's an older thread that gets folded into the story with far less scrutiny than it deserves. A commonly repeated tale traces the first sighting to the year 565 AD, when the Irish monk St. Columba, according to a biography written roughly a century after his death, is said to have encountered and banished a water beast in the River Ness. That account, while genuinely centuries old, comes from a hagiography, a genre of medieval writing built around demonstrating a saint's holiness through miraculous acts, and historians generally treat it as a devotional legend rather than a literal eyewitness record of an unusual animal. It's frequently cited in modern retellings as evidence the legend predates 1933 by well over 1,000 years, which is true in a narrow literary sense, but it's a considerably weaker piece of evidence than it's often made to sound, since it comes from a text whose primary purpose was religious instruction rather than natural history. It's also worth being clear-eyed about the powerful economic incentive that has shaped how this story gets told and retold over the decades, because it's a genuinely significant factor that rarely gets acknowledged in more sensational retellings. Loch Ness tourism has been a substantial part of the regional Highland economy since at least the 1930s, and by some estimates the legend now contributes tens of millions of pounds annually to the local economy through visitor spending, merchandise, and dedicated attractions like the Loch Ness Centre in Drumnadrahit. That's not evidence the phenomenon itself is fake. Tourism economics don't retroactively disprove sonar contacts recorded by independent researchers, but it is a legitimate reason for healthy skepticism toward any individual claim, sighting, or piece of evidence that surfaces conveniently timed with tourist season. A pattern researchers including Adrian Shine have themselves noted and cautioned against over the years while continuing their own more careful, methodical investigations. The scientific searches didn't stop after Operation Deep Scan in 1987, and it's worth including the more recent, less dramatic ones too, because they round out the picture in an important way. In 2003, the BBC funded and organized a large-scale search using 600 separate sonar beams and satellite tracking technology to sweep the loch systematically over several days, a search explicitly designed to settle the question definitively one way or the other using far more advanced technology than had been available in 1987. That search found no trace of any large unidentified animal anywhere in the loch, a null result that received considerably less media attention at the time than the earlier, more suggestive sonar contacts had, which is itself a small but telling example of how negative, inconclusive findings tend to travel less widely than tantalizing, ambiguous ones, regardless of which result actually carries more scientific weight. There's also a genuinely interesting scientific explanation for why so many independent witnesses over 91 years have converged on similar descriptions: a long neck, one or more humps, a dark curved back, without that convergence necessarily proving they all saw the same unknown animal. Researchers studying the psychology of eyewitness testimony and the physics of the loch itself have pointed to a real, well-documented phenomenon called a standing wave, or seiche, in which wind and temperature differences across a long, narrow body of water like Loch Ness can cause the water to oscillate in ways that produce a series of humps or a moving wake on the surface, even on an otherwise calm day, entirely without any animal involved. Combine that with boat wakes that persist and interact strangely in narrow, deep water, floating logs partially waterlogged and riding low enough to resemble a dark hump, and the well-documented tendency of human perception to fill in a coherent, familiar shape, especially a shape as culturally primed as sea serpent, once the brain has decided something unusual is happening, and you get a plausible account of why witnesses with no reason to lie and no connection to each other might still land on strikingly similar descriptions without having encountered the same, or any, unidentified creature. That doesn't retroactively explain every sighting on record, and researchers who raise it are generally careful not to claim it does. But it's a legitimate, evidence-based reason why convergence in eyewitness description carries less weight as proof of a real animal than it might seem to at first glance. That unresolved quality is probably the actual, honest reason the legend has endured for nearly a century, more than any specific piece of evidence for or against a monster. Few other bodies of water on Earth combine this particular mix of genuine physical difficulty to study, a rich, well-documented history of both credible investigators and outright hoaxers working the same small stretch of water, and just enough unexplained instrument data scattered across decades to keep the question technically open, even as the more sensational explanations have been steadily narrowed down or ruled out entirely. Whatever is or isn't moving through the cold, dark water of Loch Ness, the actual scientific record supports curiosity and continued careful investigation far more than it supports either confident belief or confident dismissal, and that genuinely uncertain middle ground, rather than a hidden monster or a solved hoax, is where the honest version of this story actually leaves us.